In this explainer, we're going to dive deep into the spinal cord and cerebellum. My goal is that by the end, you'll have a crystal clear, exam-level understanding of how these absolutely critical parts of our nervous system are built and how they work. So let's jump right in.
All right, let's start with the big picture, just to get our bearings. This slide gives us a fantastic orientation. You can see the brain up top, right? And then, extending down from it, you have this long, delicate structure. That's the spinal cord. And notice how it's nestled safely inside the bony vertebral column for protection. You can also see all those spinal nerves branching out at every level, connecting that central command center to literally the rest of the body.
So here's our game plan. We're going to build this up logically. We'll start with the anatomy of the spinal cord itself, its overall structure. Then we'll zoom in on the nerves and the internal pathways running through it. After that, we'll move up to the cerebellum, explore its structure and pathways, and we'll wrap it all up by looking at what happens clinically when the cerebellum gets damaged.
All right, Section 1, the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. Before we get into all the complex wiring, let's just establish the fundamental architecture of this incredible structure. Okay, let's walk through these key features one by one. First up, location. The spinal cord starts at the foramen magnum, that's the big opening at the base of your skull, and it runs all the way down to about the L1 or L2 vertebra in adults. It's housed securely within the bony vertebral canal. Next, termination. The cord itself tapers down to a point called the conus medullaris. Below that point, a whole bundle of nerve roots continues downward, and this is called the cauda equina. And for anchorage, the entire thing is tethered right down to the coccyx, your tailbone. And here's an important note. That L1, L2 endpoint is for adults. In children, the spinal cord actually ends a bit lower down.
So what does it actually do? Well, it has three core functions. First, it provides the nerve supply. That's both for feeling and for movement to the entire body below the head. Second, it's a two-way information superhighway. It carries all the sensory signals up to the brain and all the motor commands down from the brain. And third, it's a major hub for our reflexes, allowing those lightning-fast reactions that happen before your brain is even aware of them.
Now, something this important has to be well protected, right? And it is. The spinal cord is wrapped in three membranes called the meninges. Let's start from the outside and work our way in. You've got the tough outer layer, the dura mater, then the web-like arachnoid matter, and finally, the delicate pia mater, which is right on the surface of the cord. These layers create three potential spaces: the epidural space outside the dura, the subdural space, and the subarachnoid space, which is filled with that all-important cerebral spinal fluid. And for extra stability, you have these little structures called dentiliculate ligaments that anchor the cord to the dura on either side.
And this slide right here is fantastic because it lets us see everything we just talked about. Let's trace it together. Right there in the middle, that's the spinal cord. The very first thin layer wrapping it is the pia mater. See that space just outside it? That's the subarachnoid space. The next layer is the arachnoid mater, followed by the potential subdural space, and then that thick, tough outer layer, the dura mater. And finally, on the very outside, you have the epidural space. This view really makes those protective layers click.
So we've got a handle on the structure of the cord itself. Let's move on to Section 2 and look at the spinal nerves and their roots. These are the physical connections that link the central nervous system to the entire body.
So how many of these connections are we talking about? The magic number is 31. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that branch off the spinal cord. Think of them as the primary communication lines between the central nervous system and everything else.
And as this table shows us, that total of 31 pairs is broken down by region. We have 8 pairs in the cervical or neck region, 12 in the thoracic region, 5 in the lumbar, 5 in the sacral, and then that final, single coccygeal pair at the very bottom. Now technically, these spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. Each nerve attaches to the spinal cord with two roots: a dorsal root which carries incoming sensory information, and a ventral root which carries outgoing motor commands. They snake their way out of the vertebral column through little openings called the intervertebral foramina. And as we mentioned earlier, that cauda equina, which is just Latin for horse's tail, is simply the bundle of nerve roots that continue down the canal before they find their exit point.
Okay, here are two concepts that are absolutely essential for any kind of clinical diagnosis. First, you have a dermatome. That's a specific area of skin that gets its sensation from one single spinal nerve. And second, you have a myotome. That's the group of muscles controlled by a single spinal nerve root. Together, they give us a map to test nerve function.
And this diagram just illustrates that concept perfectly. On the left, you see the dermatome map, which shows how sensation on different parts of your skin corresponds to specific spinal levels. And check out the helpful mnemonics. The C7 territory can be remembered with no heaven as you make a 7 with your fingers, and T4 is right at the level of the nipple line, or teat pore. Then on the right, the myotome map links spinal nerves to specific muscle movements, like C5 for shoulder abduction or S1 for plantar flexion.
So we've seen how the spinal cord is built and how the nerves connect to it. Now for section 3, let's go deeper. Let's look inside the cord at its internal wiring, the ascending and descending pathways, or tracts, that make up its white matter.
This diagram is absolutely essential for understanding how the spinal cord works. It shows a cross-section of the white matter, and you can see it's all neatly organized into pathways. All the ascending tracts, colored here in blue, are carrying sensory information up to the brain, and all the descending tracts, shown in red, are carrying motor commands down from the brain to the body.
Now, the crucial thing to get here is that different types of sensory information travel in different lanes on this highway. Let's look at 3 major ascending pathways. First, the spinothalamic tract. This one carries your signals for pain, temperature, and crude touch. Second, the medial lemniscus pathway. This is for more detailed stuff, like fine touch and conscious proprioception. That's your sense of where your body is in space. And third, the spinocerebellar tract. This also carries proprioceptive information, but it sends it specifically to the cerebellum for unconscious coordination of your movements.
With the spinal cord covered, we're now going to ascend up to the cerebellum. This structure sits at the back of the brain, and it's basically the master center for coordination and balance.
Now don't let its size fool you. The cerebellum only weighs about 150 grams, but it is incredibly dense with neurons. Get this, it contains roughly 3.6 times more neurons than the entire neocortex. It's located in the posterior cranial fossa, right behind the brainstem, and it communicates with the brainstem through 3 massive nerve bundles called the cerebellar peduncles.
So, the cerebellum is organized in 2 different ways at the same time, which we can compare directly here. On the left, we see its longitudinal divisions. There's a central midline region called the vermis, a paravermal region on either side, and then the large lateral hemispheres. But then, on the right, you can see the transverse divisions, the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe, all separated by these deep fissures.
Okay, so now that we know the parts, let's link the cerebellum structure to its function by tracing its main input and output pathways.
This slide right here is really the key to understanding cerebellar function. We can literally trace the flow of information for each functional zone. First, down at the bottom, the vestibulocerebellum projects out to the vestibular nuclei, which handles balance. Next, the central spinocerebellum projects to the descending motor systems to help execute movements smoothly. And finally, the large lateral cerebrocerebellum projects up to the motor and premotor cortices, which is all about planning your movements.
And this table gives us a perfect summary of what we just saw. Let's review it. The vestibulocerebellum is all about balance and eye movements. The spinocerebellum is for motor execution, regulating and smoothing out movements as they happen. And the cerebrocerebellum is for motor planning and initiation, getting everything ready before you even move. And that brings us to our final section, the clinical focus. You know, one of the best ways to understand what something does is to see what happens when it goes wrong. So let's look at the signs of cerebellar damage.
Damage can happen for a few reasons: physical trauma, a stroke, cutting off blood supply, chronic alcoholism, or even cancer. But here is the single most important diagnostic clue you need to know about cerebellar damage. Unilateral lesions, that means damage to just one side of the cerebellum, produce ipsilateral symptoms. That means the symptoms appear on the same side of the body as the lesion. This is a huge clinical point.
One of the most common signs you'll see is something called gait ataxia. As this illustration shows, it's basically an unsteady, uncoordinated walk. Patients often stand with their feet wide apart to improve their stability, and they might reel from side to side as they walk, looking a lot like someone who is intoxicated.
Another classic symptom is dysmetria. This is an error in judging the distance and direction you need to reach a target. This diagram shows it perfectly. You can see the normal, direct path to a target compared to the abnormal, wavering path of a patient with dysmetria. This often causes them to overshoot or undershoot their target.
And this all leaves us with a truly fascinating question to think about. We know the cerebellum has this immense processing power, way more neurons than the cerebral cortex. We focus today on its famous role in motor control, but modern research is starting to link it to cognition and even emotion. So it just begs the question, What other critical roles is this so-called little brain playing that we are only just beginning to discover?